Welcome to my new channel called Kevin Reading Philosophy. My name is Kevin and now I'm going to attempt to read In Search of Lost Time by Marcel Proust in its entirety over several videos. I have tried reading this novel a couple times but never finished. I will be reading the Modern Library Classics version. In this first video I will be reading pages 1 through 58. I have a stutter, but it is not as bad when I read. Besides reading this very long novel, I might create videos on philosophical, historical, and other concepts I find interesting. Currently, I'm in my last year of earning my bachelor's degree in philosophy, and I'm a huge history buff. Not sure how much my stutter will affect me, though. Okay, now I will start reading pages 1 through 58 of In Search of Lost Time. Part 1, Calm. For a long time I would go to bed early, sometimes the candle barely out, my eyes closed so quickly that I did not have time to tell myself I'm falling asleep. And half an hour later, the thought that it was time to look for sleep would awaken me. I would make as if to put away the book, which I imagined was still in my hands, and to blow out the light. I had gone on thinking, while I was asleep, about what I had just been reading. But these thoughts had taken a rather peculiar turn. It seemed to me that I myself was the immediate subject of my book. A church, a quartet, the rivalry between Francois I and Charles V. This impression would persist for some moments after I awoke. It did not offend any reason, but lay like scales upon my eyes and prevented them from registering the fact that the candle was no longer burning. Then it would begin to seem unintelligible, as the thoughts of a previous existence must be after reincarnation. The subject of my book would separate itself from me, leaving me free to apply myself to it or not, and at the same time my sight would return, and I would be astonished to find myself in a state of darkness, pleasant and restful enough for my eyes, but even more perhaps for my mind, to which it appeared incomprehensible, without a cause, something dark indeed. I would ask myself what time it could be. I could hear the whistling of trains, which now near and now further off, punctuating the distance like the note of a bird in a forest, showed me in perspective the deserted countryside through which a traveler is hurrying towards the nearby station, and the path he is taking will be engraved in his memory by the excitement induced by strange surroundings, by unaccustomed activities, by the conversation he has had and the farewells exchanged beneath an unfamiliar lamp that still echo in his ears amid the silence of the night, and by the happy prospect of being home again. I would lay my cheeks gently against the comfortable cheeks of my pillow, as plump and fresh as the cheeks of childhood. I would strike a match to look at my watch, nearly midnight, the hour when an invalid who has been obliged to set out on a journey and to sleep in a strange hotel, awakened by a sudden spasm, sees with glad relief a streak of daylight showing under his door. Thank God, it is morning. The servants will be about in a minute. He can ring, and someone will come to look after him. The thought of being watched gives him strength to endure his pain. He is certain he heard footsteps. They come nearer and then die away. The ray of light beneath his door is extinguished. It is midnight somehow. Someone has just turned down the gas. The last servant has gone to bed, and he must lie all night suffering without remedy. I would fall asleep again, and therefore afterward reawaken for short snatches only, just long enough to hear the regular creaking of the wainscot, or to open my eyes to stare at the shifting kaleidoscope of the darkness, to savor in a momentary glimmer of consciousness, the sleep which lay heavy upon the furniture, the room that whole of which I formed no more than a small part, and whose insensibility I should very soon return to share. Or else, while sleeping, I had drifted back to an earlier stage in my life, now forever outgrown, and had come under the thrall of one of my childish terrors, some such as that old terror of my great uncle's pulling my curls, which was effectually dispelled on the dawn of a new era to me, when they were finally cropped from my head. I had, I had forgotten that event during my sleep, but I remembered it again immediately. I had succeeded in waking myself up to escape my great uncle's fingers, and as a measure of precaution, I would bury the whole of my head in the pillow before returning to the world of dreams. Sometimes, too, as Eve was created from a rib of Adam, a woman would be born during my sleep from some misplacing of my thigh, conceived from the pleasure I was on the point of enjoying. She it was, I imagine, who offered me that pleasure. My body, conscious that its own warmth was permeating hers, would strive to become one with her, and I would awake. The rest of humanity seemed very remote in comparison with this woman, whose company I had left but a moment ago. My cheek was still warm from her kiss. My body ached beneath the weight of hers. If, as would sometimes happen, she had the features of some woman whom I had known in waking hours, I would abandon myself altogether to this end, to find her again, like people who set out on a journey to see with their eyes some city of their desire, and imagine that one can taste in reality what has charmed one's fancy, and then gradually the memory of her would fade away. I had forgotten the girl of my dream. When a man is asleep, he has in a circle round him the chain of the hours, the sequence of the years, the order of the heavenly bodies. Instinctively he consults them when he awakes, and in an instant reads off his own position on the earth's surface and the time that has elapsed during his slumbers. But this ordered procession is apt to grow confused, and to break its ranks. Suppose that, too, towards morning, after a night of insomnia, sleep descends upon him while he is reading, in quite a different position from that in which he normally goes to sleep. He has only to lift his arm to arrest the sun and turn it back in its course, and at the moment of waking he will have no idea of the time, but will conclude that he was just gone to bed, that he has just gone to bed. Or suppose that he dozes off in some even more abnormal and divergent position, sitting in an armchair, for instance, after dinner, then the world will go hurtling out of orbit. The magic chair will carry him at full speed through time and space, and when he opens his eyes again, he will imagine that he went to sleep months earlier in another place. But for me it was enough if, in my own bed, my sleep was so heavy as completely to relax my consciousness, for then I lost all sense of the place in which I had gone to sleep, and when I awoke in the middle of the night, not knowing where I was, I could not even be sure at first who I was. I had only the most rudimentary sense of existence, such as may lurk and flicker in the depths of an animal's consciousness. I was more destitute than the cave dweller, but then the memory, not yet of the place in which I was, but of various other places where I had lived and might now very possibly be, would come like a rope let down from heaven to draw me up out of the abyss of not being, from which I could never have escaped by myself. In a flash I would traverse centuries of civilization, and out of a blurred glimpse of oil lamps, then of shirts with turned-down collars, would gradually piece together the original components of my ego. Perhaps the immobility of the things that surround us is forced upon them by our conviction that they are themselves and not anything else, by the immobility of our conception of them. For it always happened that when I awoke like this, and my mind struggled in an unsuccessful attempt to discover where I was. Everything revolved around me through the darkness. Things, places, years. My body, still too heavy with sleep to move, would endeavor to construe from the pattern of its tiredness the position of its various limbs, in order to deduce therefrom the direction of the wall, the location of the furniture, to piece together and give a name to the house in which it lays. Its memory, the composite memory of its ribs, its knees, its shoulder blades, offered it a series of rooms in which it had at one time or another slept, while their unseen walls, shifting and adapting themselves to the shape of each successive room that it remembered, whirled around it in the dark. And even before my brain, hesitating at the threshold of times and shapes, had reassembled the circumstances sufficiently to identify the room, it, my body, would recall from each room in succession the style of the bed, the position of the doors, the angle at which the daylight came in at the windows, whether there was a passage outside, what I had had in mind when I went to sleep and found there when I awoke. The stiffened side on which I lay would, for instance, in trying to fix its position, imagine itself to be lying face to the wall, in a big bed with a canopy, and at once I would say to myself, "Why, I must have fallen asleep before Mamma came to say good night," for I was in the country at my grandfather's who died years ago, and my body, the side upon which I was lying, faithful guardians of a past which my mind should never have forgotten, brought back before my eyes the glimmering flame of the nightlight, and its urn-shaped bowl of Bohemian glass that hung by chains from the ceiling, and the chimney-piece of Sienna marble in my bedroom at Combray, in my grandparents' house, in those far distant days which at this moment I imagine to be in the present without being able to picture them exactly, and which would become plainer in a little while when I was properly awake. Then the memory of a new position would spring up, and the wall would slide away in another direction. I was in my room in Madame de Saint Lup's house in the country. Good heavens, it must be 10 o'clock. They will have finished dinner. I must have overslept myself in the little nap which I always take when I come in from my walk with Madame de Saint Loup before dressing for the evening. For many years have now elapsed since the Combray days, when coming in from the longest and latest walks, I would still be in time to see the reflection of the sunset glowing in the panes of my bedroom window. It is a very different kind of life that one leads at Tansonville, at Madame de Saint Lup's, and a different kind of pleasure that I derive from taking walks only in the evenings, from visiting by moonlight the roads on which I used to play as a child in the sunlight, and for the bedroom in which I must have fallen asleep. Instead of dressing for dinner, I can see it from the distance as we return from our walk, with its lamp shining through the window, a solitary beacon in the night. These shifting and confused gusts of memory never lasted for more than a few seconds. It often happened that, in my brief spell of uncertainty as to where I was, I did not distinguish the various suppositions of which it was composed any more than when we watch a horse running. We isolate the successive positions of its body as they appear upon a bioscope. But I had seen first one and then another of the rooms in which I had slept during my life, and in the end I would revisit them all in the long course of my waking dream. Rooms in winter, where on going to bed I would at once bury my head in a nest woven out of the most diverse materials. The corner of my pillow, the top of my blankets, a piece of a shawl, the edge of my bed, and a copy of a children's paper, which I had contrived to cement together, bird fashion, by dint of continuous pressure. rooms where in freezing weather I would enjoy the satisfaction of being shut in from the outer world, like the sea swallow which builds at the end of a dark tunnel and is kept warm by the surrounding earth, and where the fire keeping in all night, I would sleep wrapped up, as it were, in a great cloak of snug and smoky air, shot with the glow of the logs intermittently breaking out again in flame. A sort of alcove without walls, a cave of warmth dug out of the heart of the room itself, a zone of heat whose boundaries were constantly shifting and altering in temperature as gusts of air traversed them to strike freshly upon my face, from the corners of the room or from parts near the window or far from the fireplace, which had therefore remained cold, or rooms in summer where I would delight to feel myself a part of the warm night, where the moonlight striking upon the half-opened shutters would throw down to the foot of my bed its enchanted ladder, where I would fall asleep as it might be in the open air like a titmouse, with the breeze gently rocks at the tip of a sunbeam, or sometimes the Louis XVI room, so cheerful that I never felt so miserable in it, even on my first night, and in which the slender columns that lightly supported its ceiling drew so gracefully apart to reveal and frame the side of the bed. Sometimes again the little room with the high ceiling, hollowed in the form of a pyramid out of two separate stories, and partly walled with mahogany, which from the first moment mentally poisoned by the unfamiliar scent of vetiver. I was convinced of the hostility of the violet curtains and of the insolent indifference of a clock that chattered on at the top of its voice as though I were not there, in which a strange and pitiless rectangular cheval glass, standing across one corner of the room, carved out for itself a sight I had not looked to find tenanted in the soft plenitude of my normal field of vision, in which my mind, striving for hours on end to break away from its moorings, to stretch upward so as to take on the exact shape of the room, and to reach to the topmost height of its gigantic funnel, had endured many a painful night as I lay stretched out in bed, my eyes staring upwards, my ears straining, my nostrils flaring, my heart beating, until habit had changed the color of the curtains, silenced the clock, brought an expression of pity to the cruel, slanting face of the glass, disguised or even completely dispelled the scent of vetiver, and appreciably reduced the apparent loftiness of the ceiling. Habit, that skillful but slow-moving arranger who begins by letting our minds suffer for weeks on end in temporary quarters, but whom our minds are nonetheless only too happy to discover at last, for without it, reduced to their own devices, they would be powerless to make any room seem habitable. Certainly I was now well awake, my body had veered round for the last time, and the good angel of certainty had made all the surrounding objects stand still. This had set me down under my bedclothes in my bedroom, and had fixed approximately in their right places in the uncertain light my chest of drawers, my writing table, my fireplace, the window overlooking the street, and both the doors. But for all that I now knew, that I was not in any of the houses of which the ignorance of the waking moment had, in a flash, if not presented me with a distinct picture, at least persuaded me of the possible presence, my memory had been set in motion. As a rule, I did not attempt to go to sleep again at once, but used to spend the greater part of the night recalling our life in the old days at Combray with my great-uncle, at Baalbec, Paris, Doncières, Venice, and the rest, remembering again all the places and people I had known, what I had actually seen of them and what others had told me. At Combray, as every afternoon ended, long before the time when I should have to go to bed and lie there unsleeping, far from my mother and grandmother, my bedroom became the fixed point on which my melancholy and anxious thoughts were centered. Someone had indeed had the happy idea of giving me, to distract me on evenings when I seemed abnormally wretched, a magic lantern which used to be set on top of my lamp while we waited for dinner time to come, and after the fashion of the master builders and glass painters of Gothic days. It substituted for the opaqueness of my walls an impalpable iridescence, supernatural phenomena of many colors, in which legends were depicted as on a shifting and transitory window, but my sorrows were only increased thereby, because this mere change of lighting was enough to destroy the familiar impression of I had of my room, thanks to which, save for the torture of going to bed, it had become quite endurable. Now I no longer recognized it and felt uneasy in it as in a room in some hotel or chalet, in a place where I had just arrived by train for the first time. Riding at a jerky trot, Golo, filled with an infamous design, issued from the little triangular forest, which softened with dark green the slope of a hill and advanced fitfully towards the castle of poor Genevieve de Bourbon. This castle was cut off short by a curved line, which was in fact the circumference of one of the transparent ovals, and the sides which were pushed into position through a slot in the lantern. It was only the wing of a castle, and in front of it stretched a moor in which Genevieve stood dreaming, wearing a blue girdle. The castle and the moor were yellow, but I could tell their color without waiting to see them, for before the slides made their appearance, the old sonorous name of Bourbon had given me an unmistakable clue. Golo stopped for a moment and listened sadly to the accompanying patter read aloud by my great aunt, which he seemed perfectly to understand, for he modified his attitude with a docility not devoid of a degree of majesty, so as to conform to the indications given in the text. Then he rode away at the same jerky trot, and nothing could arrest his slow progress. If the lantern removed, I could still distinguish Golo's horse advancing across the window curtains, swelling out with himself, being of the same supernatural substance as his steeds, overcame every material obstacle, everything that seemed to bar his way, by taking it as an asseter and absorbing it into himself, even the doorknob, on which, adapting themselves at once, his red cloak or his pale face, still as noble and as melancholy, floated invincibly, would never betray the least concern at this transverberation. And indeed I found plenty of charm in these red projections, which seemed to emanate from a Merovingian past, and shed around me the reflections of such an ancient history. But I cannot express the discomfort I felt at this intrusion of mystery and beauty into a room which I had succeeded in filling with my own personality until I thought no more of it than of myself. The anesthetic effect of habit being destroyed, I would begin to think, and to feel such melancholy things. The doorknob of my room, which was different to me from all the other doorknobs in the world, inasmuch as it seemed to move of its own accord, and without my having to turn it, so unconscious had its manipulation become. Lo and behold, it was now an astral body for Golo, and as soon as the dinner bell rang, I would hurry down to the dining room, where the big hanging lamp, ignorant of Golo and Bluebeard, but well Acquainted with my family, and the dish of stewed beef shed the same light as on every other evening, and I would fall into the arms of my mother, whom the misfortunes of Genevieve de Bourbon had made all the dearer to me, just as the crimes of Gullo had driven me to a more than ordinarily scrupulous examination of my own conscience. But after dinner, alas, I was soon obliged to leave Mamma, who stayed talking with the others in the garden if it was fine, or in the little parlor where everyone took shelter when it was wet. Everyone except my grandmother, who held that it's a pity to shut oneself indoors in the country, and used to have endless arguments with my father on the very wettest days, because he would send me up to my room with a book instead of letting me stay out of doors. That is not the way to make him strong and active, she would say sadly, especially this little man who needs all the strength and willpower that he can get. My father would shrug his shoulders and study the barometer, for he took an interest in meteorology, while my mother, keeping very quiet so as not to disturb him, looked at him with tender respect but not too hard, not wishing to penetrate the mysteries of his superior mind. But my grandmother, in all weathers, even when the rain was coming down in torrents, and Francois had rushed the precious wicker armchairs indoors so that they should not get soaked, was to be seen pacing the deserted, rain-lashed garden, pushing back her disordered gray locks so that her forehead might be freer to absorb the health-giving drops of wind and rain. She would say, "At last one can breathe," and would trot up and down the sodden paths, too straight and symmetrical for her liking, owing to the want of any feeling for nature in the new gardener, whom my father had been asking all morning if the weather were going to improve. Her keen, jerky little step regulated by the various effects wrought upon her soul by the intoxication of the storm, the power of hygiene, the stupidity of my upbringing, and the symmetry of gardens, rather than by any anxiety, for that was quite unknown to her, to save her plum-colored skirt from the mud stains beneath which it would gradually disappear to a height that was the constant bane and despair of her maid. When these walks of my grandmother's took place after dinner, there was one thing which never failed to bring her back to the house. This was, if at one of those points when her circular itinerary brought her back, moth-like, in sight of the lamp in the little parlor, where the liqueurs were set out on the card table, my great-aunt called out to her, "Bathilda, come in and stop your husband drinking brandy," for, simply to tease her, she had brought so different a type of mind into my father's family that everyone made fun of her. My great-aunt used to make my grandfather, who was forbidden liquors, take just a few drops. My poor grandmother would come in and beg and implore her husband not to taste the brandy, and he would get angry and gulp it down all the same, and she would go out again, sad and discouraged, but still smiling, for she was so humble of heart and so gentle that her tenderness for others and her disregard for herself and her own troubles blended in a smile which, unlike those seen on the majority of human faces, bore no trace of irony save for herself, while for all of us kisses seemed to spring from her eyes, which could not look upon those she loved without seeming to bestow upon them passionate caresses. This torture inflicted on her by my great-aunt, the sight of my grandmother's vain entreaties, of her feeble attempts, doomed in advance, to remove the liqueur-glass from my grandfather's hands, all these were things of the sort to which in later years one can grow so accustomed as to smile at them and take the precursor's sight resolutely and cheerfully, enough to persuade oneself that it is not really persecution, But in those days they filled me with such horror that I longed to strike my great aunt. And yet as soon as I heard her Bathilda, come in and stop your husband drinking brandy, in my cowardice I became a man at once, and did what all we grown men do when face to face with suffering and injustice. I preferred not to see them. I ran up to the top of the house to cry by myself in a little room beside the schoolroom and beneath the roof, which smelt of orris root, and was scented also by currant, a wild currant bush, which had climbed up between the stones of the outer wall, and thrust a flowering branch in through the half-open window. Intended for a more special and a baser use, this room, from which in the daytime I could see as far as the keep of Rouzonville-le-Pin, was for a long time my place of refuge, doubtless because it was the only room whose door I was allowed to lock. Whenever my occupation was such as required an inviolable solitude, reading or daydreaming, tears, or sensual pleasure, alas, I did not realize that my own lack of willpower, my delicate health, and the consequent uncertainty as to my future weighed far more heavily on my grandmother's mind than any little dietary indiscretion by her husband in the course of those endless perambulations, afternoon and evening, during which we used to see her handsome face passing to and fro, half raised towards the sky, its brown and wrinkled cheeks, which with age had acquired almost the purple hue of tilled fields in autumn, covered, if she were going out, by the half-lifted veil, while upon them either the coat or some sad reflection invariably left the drawing traces of an involuntary tear. My sole consolation when I went upstairs for the night was that Mamma would come in and kiss me after I was in bed. But this good night lasted for so short a time. She went down again so soon that the moment in which I heard her climb the stairs and then caught the sound of her garden dress of blue muslin, from which hung little tassels of plaited straw, rustling along the double-doored corridor, was for me a moment of the utmost pain, for it heralded the moment which was to follow it, when she would have left me and gone downstairs again. So much so that I reached the point of hoping that this good night which I loved so much would come as late as possible, so as to prolong the time of respite during which Mamma would not yet have appeared. Sometimes when, after kissing me, she opened the door to go, I longed to call her back to say to her, "Kiss me just once more." But I knew that then she would at once look displeased, for the concession which she made to my wretchedness and agitation is coming up to give me the kiss of peace always, annoyed my father, who thought such rituals absurd, and she would have liked to try to induce me to outgrow the habit of having her there at all, let alone get into the habit of asking her for an additional kiss when she was already crossing the threshold. And to see her look displeased destroyed all the calm and serenity she had brought me a moment before, when she had bent her loving face down over my bed and held it out to me like a host for an act of peace-giving communion, in which my lips might imbibe her real presence, and with it the power to sleep. By those evenings on which Mamma stayed so short a time in my room were sweet indeed compared to those on which we had people to dinner, and therefore she did not come at all. Our people were usually limited to Monsieur Swann, who, apart from a few passing strangers, was almost the only person who ever came to the house at Combray, sometimes to a neighborly dinner, but less frequently, since his unfortunate marriage, as my family did not care to receive his wife, and sometimes after dinner uninvited. On those evenings when, as we sat in front of the house round the iron table beneath the big chestnut tree, we heard from the far end of the garden, not the shrill and assertive alarm bell which assailed and deafened with its ferruginous, interminable, frozen sound any member of the household who set it off on entering without ringing, but the double tinkle, timid oval, golden, of the visitor's bell. Everyone would at once exclaim, "A visitor! Who in the world can it be?" But they knew quite well that it could only be Monsieur Swann. My great aunt, speaking in a loud voice to set an example, in a tone which she endeavored to make sound natural, would tell the others not to whisper so, that nothing could be more offensive to a stranger coming in, who would be led to think that people were saying things about him which he was not meant to hear. And then my grandmother, always happy to find an excuse for an additional turn in the garden, would be sent out to reconnoiter, and would take the opportunity to remove surreptitiously, as she passed, the stakes of a rose tree or two, so as to make the roses look a little more natural, as a mother might run her hand through her baby's hair after the barber has smoothed it down to make it look naturally wavy. We would all wait there in suspense for the report, which my grandmother would bring back from the enemy lines, as though there might be a choice between a large number of possible assailants, and then soon after my grandfather would say, "I recognize one's voice," and indeed one could tell him only by his voice, for it was difficult to make out his face with its arched nose and green eyes under a high forehead fringed with fair, almost short hair, done in the Brazil style, because in the garden we used as little light as possible so as not to attract mosquitoes, and I would slip away unobtrusively to order the liquors to be brought out, for my grandmother made a great point, thinking it nicer, of their not being allowed to see anything out of the ordinary, which we kept for visitors only. Although a far younger man, Monsieur Swann was very attached to my grandfather, who had been an intimate friend of Swann's father, an excellent but eccentric man, the ardor of whose feelings and the current of whose thoughts would often be checked or diverted by the most trifling thing. Several times in the course of a year I would hear my grandfather tell at table the story which never varied, of the behavior of Monsieur Swann, the elder, upon the death of his wife, by whose bedside he had watched day and night. My grandfather, who had not seen him for a long time, hastened to join him at the Swann's family property on the outskirts of Combray, and managed to entice him for a moment, weeping profusely, out of the death chamber, so that he should not be present when the body was laid in its coffin. They took a turn or two in the park, where there was a little sunshine. Suddenly Monsieur Swann seized my grandfather by the arm and cried, "Ah, my dear old friend, how fortunate we are to be walking here together on such a charming day. Don't you see how pretty they are, all these trees, my hawthorns, and my new pond, on which you have never congratulated me? You look as solemn as the grave. Don't you feel this little breeze? Ah, whatever you may say, it's good to be alive all the same, my dear Amédée." And then abruptly the memory of his dead wife returned to him, and probably thinking it too complicated to inquire into how at such a time he could have allowed himself to be carried away by an impulse of happiness, he confined himself to a gesture which he habitually employed whenever any perplexing question came into his mind. That is, he passed his hand across his forehead, rubbed his eyes, and wiped his glasses. And yet he never got over the loss of his wife, but used to say to my grandfather during the 2 years by which he survived her, "It's a funny thing now. I very often think of my poor wife, but I cannot think of her for long at a time. Often, but a little at a time, like poor old Swan," became one of my grandfather's favorite sayings, which he would apply to all manner of things. I should have assumed that this father of swans had been a monster if my grandfather, whom I regarded as a better judge than myself, and whose word was my law and often led me in the long run to pardon offences which I should have been inclined to condemn, had not gone on to exclaim, "But after all, he had a heart of gold." For many years, during the course of which, especially before his marriage, Monsieur Swann the younger came often to see them at Combray, my great-aunt and my grandparents never suspected that he had entirely ceased to live in the society which his family had frequented, and that under the sort of incognito which the name of Swan gave him among us, they were harboring with the complete innocence of a family of respectable innkeepers who have in their midst some celebrated highwayman, without knowing it, one of the most distinguished members of the Jockey Club, a particular friend of the Comte de Paris and of the Prince of Wales, and one of the men most sought after in the aristocratic world of the Faubourg Saint-Germain. Our utter ignorance of the brilliant social life which Swann led was of course due in part to his own reserve and discretion, but also to the fact that middle-class people in those days took what was most a Hindu view of society, which they held to consist of sharply defined castes, so that everyone at his birth found himself called to that station in life which his parents already occupied, and, and from which nothing gave the accident of an exceptional career, or of a good marriage, could extract you and translate you to a superior caste. Monsieur Swann the elder had been a stockbroker, and so young Swann found himself immured for life in a caste whose members' fortunes, as in category of taxpayers, varied between such and such limits of income. One knew the people with whom his father had associated, and so one knew his own associates, the people with whom he was in a position to mix. If he knew other people besides, those were youthful acquaintances on which the old friends of his family, like my relatives, shut their eyes all the more good-naturedly because Swann himself, after he was left an orphan, still came most faithfully to see us. But we would have been ready to wager that the people outside our acquaintance whom Swann knew were of the sort to whom he would not have dared to raise his hat if he had met them while he was walking with us. Had he been absolutely essential to apply to Swann a social coefficient peculiar to himself, as distinct from all the other sons of other stockbrokers, in his father's position his coefficient would have been rather lower than theirs, because being very simple in his habits, and having always had a craze for antiques and pictures, he now lived and amassed his collections in an old house which my grandmother longed to visit, but which was situated on the Quai d'Orléans, a neighborhood in which my great-aunt thought it most degrading to be quartered. "Are you really a connoisseur at least?" she would say to him. I ask for your own sake, as you are likely to have fakes palmed off on you by the dealers." For she did not, in fact, endow him with any critical faculty, and had no great opinion of the intelligence of a man who, in conversation, would avoid serious topics, and showed a very dull preciseness, not only when he gave us kitchen recipes, going into the most minute details, but even when my grandmother's sisters were talking to him about art. When challenged by them to give an opinion or to express his admiration for some picture, he would remain almost disobligingly silent, and would then make amends by furnishing, if he could, some fact or other about the gallery in which the picture was hung, or the date at which it had been painted. But as a rule he would content himself with trying to amuse us by telling us about his latest adventure with someone whom we ourselves knew, such as the Combray chemist, or our cook, or our coachman. These stories certainly used to make my great aunt laugh, but she could never decide whether this was on account of the absurd role which Swann invariably gave himself therein, or of the wit that he showed in telling them. I must say you really are a regular character, Monsieur Swann. As she was the only member of her family who could be described as a trifle common, she would always take care to remark to strangers when Swann was mentioned, that he could easily, had he so wished, have lived in the Boulevard Haussmann or the Avenue de l'Opera, and that he was the son of old Monsieur Swann, who must have left 4 or 5 million francs, but that it was a fad of his, a fad which, moreover, she thought was bound to amuse other people, on so much that in Paris, when Monsieur Swann called on New Year's Day, bringing her a little packet of Maron's glasses, she never failed, if there were strangers in the room, to say to him, "Well, Monsieur Swann, and do you still live next door to the bonded warehouse, so as to be sure of not missing your train when you go to Lyons?" And she would peep out of the corner of her eye over her glasses at the other visitors. But if any one had suggested to my great aunt that this Swann, who in his capacity as the son of old Monsieur Swann was fully qualified to be received by any of the best people, by the most respected barristers and solicitors of Paris, though he was perhaps a trifle inclined to let this hereditary privilege go by default, had another almost secret existence of a wholly different kind, that when he left our house in Paris, saying that he must go home to bed, he would no sooner have returned the corner than he would stop, retrace his steps, and be off to some salon on whose like no stockbroker or associate of stockbrokers had ever set eyes. That would have seemed to my aunt as extraordinary as to a woman of wider reading the thought of being herself on terms of intimacy with Aristides, and of learning that after having a chat with her, he would plunge deep into the realms of Thetis, into an empire veiled from mortal eyes, in which Virgil depicts him as being received with open arms, or to be content with an image more likely to have occurred to her, for she had seen it painted on plates we used for biscuits at Combray, as the thought of having had to dinner Ali Baba, who as soon as he finds himself alone and unobserved will make his way into the cave resplendent with its unsuspected treasures. One day when he had come to see us after dinner in Paris, apologizing for being in evening clothes, Francois told us after he had left that he had got it from his coachman, that he had been dining with a princess. "A nice sort of princess," retorted my aunt, shrugging her shoulders without raising her eyes from her knitting, serenely sarcastic. Altogether, my great aunt treated him with scant ceremony, since she was of the opinion that he ought to feel flattered by our invitations. She thought it only right and proper that he should never come to see us in summer without a basket of peaches or raspberries from his garden, and that from each of his visits to Italy he should bring back some photographs of old masters for me. It seemed quite natural, therefore, to send for him whenever a recipe for some special sauce or for a pineapple salad was needed for one of our big dinner parties, to which he himself would not be invited, being regarded as insufficiently important to be served up to new friends who might be in our house for the first time. If the conversation turned upon the princes of the House of France, "Gentlemen, you and I will never know, will we, and don't want to, do we?" my great aunt would say tartly to Swann, who had perhaps a letter from Twickenham in his pocket. She would make him push the piano into place and turn over the music on evenings when my grandmother's sister sang, manipulating this voice, who was elsewhere so sought after with the rough simplicity of a child who will play with a collector's piece with no more circumspection than if it were a cheap gewgaw. Doubtless the Swan, who was a similar figure in all the clubs of those days, differed hugely from the Swan created by my great aunt, when of an evening, in our little garden at Combray, after the two shy peals had sounded from the gate, she would inject and vitalize with everything she knew about the Swan family the obscure and shadowy figure who emerged, with my grandmother in his wake, from the dark background, and who was identified by his voice. But then, even in the most insignificant details of our daily life, none of us can be said to constitute a material whole which is identical for everyone, and need only be turned up like a page in an account book or the record of a will. Our social personality is a creation of the thoughts of other people. Even the simple act which we describe as seeing someone we know is to some extent an intellectual process. We pack the physical outline of the person we see with all the notions we have already formed about him, and in the total picture of him which we compose in our minds, those notions have certainly the principal place. In the end they come to fill out so completely the curve of his cheeks, to follow so exactly the line of his nose, they blend so harmoniously in the sound of his voice, as if it were no more than a transparent envelope, that each time we see the face or hear the voice, it is these notions which we recognize and to which we listen. And so no doubt from the Swan they have constructed for themselves, my family had left out, in their ignorance, a whole host of details of his life in the world of fashion, details which caused other people, when they met him, to see all the graces enthroned in his face, and stopping at the line of his aquiline nose as a natural frontier. But they had contrived also to put into his face, divested of all glamour, vacant and roomy as an untenanted house, to plant in the depths of these undervalued eyes a lingering residuum, vague but not unpleasing, half memory and half oblivion, of idle hours spent together after our weekly dinners round the card table, or in the garden during our companionable country life. Our friend's corporeal envelope had been so well lined with this residuum, as well as various earlier memories of his parents, that their own special Swan had become to my family a complete and living creature, so that even now I have the feeling of leaving someone I know for another quite different person, when, going back in memory, I passed from the Swan whom I knew later, and more intimately, to this early Swan in whom I can distinguish the charming mistakes of my youth, and who in fact is less like his successor than he is like the other people I knew at that time, as though one's life were a picture gallery in which all the portraits of any one period had a marked family likeness, a similar tonality, this early swan abounding in leisure, fragrant with the scent of the great chestnut tree, of baskets of raspberries, and of a sprig of tarragon. And yet one day when my grandmother had gone to ask some favor of a lady whom she had known at the Sacre Coeur, and with whom, because of our notions of caste, she had not cared to keep up any degree of intimacy in spite of several common interests. The Marquis de Villeparisis of the famous house of Bouillon, this lady had said to her, "I believe you know Monsieur Swann very well. He is a great friend of my nephew and niece, the Deslombes." My grandmother had returned from the call full of praise for the house, which overlooked some gardens and in which Madame de Villeparisis had advised her to rent a flat, and also for a repairing tailor and his daughter who kept a little shop in the courtyard, into which she had gone to ask them to put a stitch in her skirt, which she had torn on their staircase. My grandmother had found these people perfectly charming. The girl, she said, was a jewel, and the tailor the best and most distinguished man she had ever seen. For in her eyes distinction was a thing wholly independent of social position. She was in ecstasies over some answer the tailor had made to her, saying to Mamma, "Savine would not have put it better," and by way of contrast, of a nephew of Madame de Villeparisis, whom she had met at the house. My dear, he is so common. Now the effect of the remark about Swann had been, not to raise him in my great-aunt's estimation, but to lower Madame de Villeparisis. It appeared that the deference which, on my grandmother's authority, we owed to Madame de Villeparisis imposed on her the reciprocal obligation to do nothing that would render her less worthy of our regard, and that she had failed in this duty by becoming aware of Swann's existence, and in allowing members of her family to associate with him. What? She knows Swann? A person who, you always made out, was related to Marshal MacMahon? The view of Swann's social position, which prevailed in my family, seemed to be confirmed later on by his marriage with a woman of the worst type, almost a prostitute, whom, to do him justice, he never attempted to introduce to us, for he continued to come to our house alone, though more and more seldom, but from whom they felt they could establish, on the assumption that he had found her there, the circle unknown to them in which he ordinarily moved. But on one occasion my grandfather read in a newspaper that Monsieur Swann was one of the most regular attendants at the Sunday luncheons given by the Duc de X, whose father and uncle had been among our most prominent statesmen in the reign of Louis Philippe. Now my grandfather was curious to learn all the smallest details which might help him to take a mental share in the private lives of men like Molé, the Duc Pasquier, or the Duc de Broglie. He was delighted to find that Swann associated with people who had known them. My great-aunt, on the other hand, interpreted this piece of news in a sense discreditable to Swann, for anyone who chose his associates outside the caste in which he had been born and bred, outside his proper station, automatically lowered himself in her eyes. It seemed to her that such a one abdicated all claim to enjoy the fruits of the splendid connections with people of good position which prudent parents cultivate and store up for their children's benefit, and she had actually ceased to see the son of a lawyer of our acquaintance because he had married a highness, and had thereby stepped down in her eyes from the respectable position of a lawyer's son. to that of those adventurers, upstart footmen, or stable boys, mostly, to whom we are told queens have sometimes shown their favors. She objected therefore to my grandfather's plan of questioning Swann. When next he came to dine with us about these people whose friendship with him we had discovered, at the same time my grandmother's two sisters, elderly spinsters, who shared her nobility of character but lacked her intelligence, declared that they could not conceive what pleasure their brother-in-law could find in talking about such trifles. They were ladies of lofty aspirations, who for that reason were incapable of taking the least interest in what might be termed gossip, even if it had some historical import, or generally speaking in anything that was not directly associated with some aesthetic or virtuous object. So complete was their negation of interest in anything which seemed directly or indirectly connected with worldly matters, that their sense of hearing, having finally come to realize its temporary futility, when the tone of the conversation at the dinner table became frivolous or merely mundane, without the two old ladies being able to guide it back to topics dear to themselves, would put its receptive organs into abeyance to the point of actually becoming atrophied, so that if my grandfather wished to attract the attention of the two sisters, he had to resort to some such physical stimuli as alienists adopt in dealing with their distracted patients, to wit, repeated taps on a glass with the blade of a knife, accompanied by a sharp word and a compelling glance. Violent methods which the psychiatrists are apt to bring with them into their everyday life among the sane, either from force of professional habit or because they think the whole world a trifle mad. Their interest grew, however, when the day before Swann was to dine with us, and when he had made them a special present, a case of Asti, my great-aunt, who had in her hand a copy of the Figaro, in which to the name of a picture then on view in Corot exhibition were added the words, "From the collection of Monsieur Charles Swann," asked, "Did you see that Swann is mentioned in the Figaro?" "But I have always told you," said my grandmother, "that he had a great deal of taste." "You would, of course," retorted my great-aunt, "say anything just to seem different from us." For, knowing that my grandmother never agreed with her, and not being quite confident that it was her own opinion, which the rest of us invariably endorsed, she wished to extort from us a wholesale condemnation, my grandmother's views against which she hoped to force us into solidarity with her own. But we sat silent, my grandmother's sisters having expressed a desire to mention to Swann this reference to him in the Figaro. My great-aunt dissuaded them. Whenever he saw in others an advantage, however trivial, which she herself lacked, she would persuade herself that it was no advantage at all, but a drawback, and would pity so as not to have to envy them. I don't think that would please him at all. I know very well that I should hate to see my name printed like that, as large as life in the paper, and I shouldn't feel at all flattered if anyone spoke to me about it. She did not, however, put any very great pressure upon my grandmother's sisters, for they, in their horror of vulgarity, had brought to such a fine art the concealment of a personal illusion and wealth of ingenious circumlocution, that it would often pass unnoticed even by the person to whom it was addressed. As for my mother, her only thought was of trying to induce my father to speak to Swann, not about his wife, but about his daughter, whom he worshipped, and for whose sake it was understood that he had ultimately made his unfortunate marriage. You need only say a word, just ask him how she is. It must be so very hard for him. My father, however, was annoyed. No, no, you have the most absurd ideas. It would be utterly ridiculous. But the only one of us in whom the prospect of Swan's rival gave rise to an unhappy foreboding was myself. This was because on the evenings when there were visitors, or just Monsieur Swan in the house, Mamma did not come up to my room. I dined before the others, and afterwards came and sat at table until 8 o'clock, when it was understood that I must go upstairs. That frail and precious kiss which Mamma used normally to bestow on me when I was in bed and just going to sleep had to be transported from the dining room to my bedroom, where I must keep it inviolate all the time that it took me to undress, without letting its sweet charm be broken, without letting its volatile essence diffuse itself and evaporate. And it was precisely on those very evenings when I needed to receive it with special care that I was obliged to take it, to snatch it brusquely and in public, without even having the time or the equanimity to bring to what I was doing the single-minded attention of lunatics who compel themselves to exclude all other thoughts from their minds, while they are shutting a door so when the sickness of uncertainty sweeps over them again, they can triumphantly oppose it with the recollection of the precise moment when they shut the door. We were all in the garden when the double tinkle of the visitors' bell sounded shyly. Everyone knew that it must be Swan, and yet they looked at one another inquiringly and set my grandmother to reconnoiter. See that you thank him intelligibly for the wine. My grandfather warned his two sisters-in-law. You know how good it is, and the case is huge. Now don't start whispering, said my great-aunt. How would you like to come into our house and find everyone muttering to themselves? Ah, there's Monsieur Swan, cried my father. Let's ask him if he thinks it will be fine tomorrow. My mother fancied that a word from her would wipe out all the distress which my family had contrived to cause Swan since his marriage. She found an opportunity to draw him aside for a moment, but I followed her. I could not bring myself to let her out of my sight, while I felt that in a few minutes I should have to leave her in the dining room and go up to my bed without the consoling thought, as on ordinary evenings, that she would come up later to kiss me. Now, Monsieur Swan, she said, do tell me about your daughter. I'm sure she already has a taste for beautiful things like your papa. Come along and sit down here with us all on the veranda, said my grandfather, coming up to him. My mother had to abandon her quest, but managed to extract from the restriction itself a further delicate thought, like good poets from whom the tyranny of rhyme forces into the discovery of their finest lines. We can talk about her again when we are by ourselves, she said, or rather whispered to Swan. Only a mother is capable of understanding these things. I'm sure that hers would agree with me. And so we all sat down round the iron table. I should have liked not to think of the hours of anguish which I should have to spend that evening alone in my room, without being able to go to sleep. I tried to convince myself that they were of no importance, since I should have forgotten them next morning, and to fix my mind on thoughts of the future, which would carry me as on a bridge across the terrifying abyss that yawned at my feet. But my mind, strained by this foreboding, distended like the look which I shot at my mother, would not allow any extraneous impression to enter. Thoughts did indeed enter it, but only on the condition that they left behind them every element of beauty, or even of humor, by which I might have been distracted or beguiled. As a surgical patient, thanks to a local anesthetic, can look on fully conscious while an operation is being performed upon him and yet feel nothing. I could repeat to myself some favorite lines, or watch my grandfather's efforts to talk as one about the duc Daudifere Pasquier without being able to kindle any emotion from the one of amusement from the other. Hardly had my grandfather begun to question Swann about that orator when one of my grandmother's sisters, in whose ears the question echoed like a solemn but untimely silence, which her natural politeness bade her interrupt, addressed the other with, "Just fancy, Flora. I met a young Swedish governess today who told me some most interesting things about the cooperative movement in Scandinavia. We really must have her to dine here one evening." "To be sure," said her sister Flora, "but I haven't wasted my time either. I met such a clever old gentleman at Monsieur Vontoyle's who knows Maubant quite well, and Maubant has told him every little thing about how he gets up his parts. It's the most interesting thing I ever heard. He's a neighbor of Monsieur Vontoyle's, and I never knew, and he is so nice besides." "Monsieur Vontoyle is not the only one who has nice neighbors," cried my Aunt Celine in a voice that was loud because of shyness and forced because of premeditation, darting as she spoke what she called a significant glance at Swann. And my Aunt Flora, who realized that this veiled utterance was Celine's way of thanking Swann for the honesty, looked at him also with a blend of congratulation and irony, either because she simply wished to underline her sister's little witticism, or because she envied Swann as having inspired it, or because she imagined that she was embarrassed and could not help having a little fun at his expense. "I think it would be worthwhile," Flora went on, "to have this old gentleman to dinner. When you get him going on Maubant or Madame Materna, he will talk for hours on end." "That must be delightful," sighed my grandfather, in whose mind nature had unfortunately forgotten to include any capacity whatsoever for becoming passionately interested in the Swedish cooperative movement, or in the methods employed by Maubant to get up his parts, just as it had forgotten to endow my grandmother's two sisters with a grain of that precious salt which one has oneself to add to taste, in order to extract any savor from a narrative of the private life of Mole or of the Comte de Paris. "By the way," said Swann to my grandfather, "what I was going to tell you has more to do than you might think with what you were asking me just now, for in some respects there has been very little change. I came across a passage in Saint Simon this morning which would have amused you. It's in the volume which covers his mission to Spain, not one of the best, little more in fact than a journal, but at least a wonderfully well-written journal which fairly distinguishes it from the tedious journals we feel bound to read morning and evening. I don't agree with you. There are some days when I find reading the papers very pleasant indeed." My Aunt Flora broke in, to show Swann that she had read the note about his Corot in the Figaro. "Yes," Aunt Celine went on better, "when they write about things or people in whom we are interested." "I don't deny it," answered Swann in some bewilderment. "The fault I find with our journalism is that it forces us to take an interest in some fresh triviality or other every day, whereas only 3 or 4 books in a lifetime give us anything that is of real importance. Suppose that every morning, when we tore off the wrapper off our paper with favored hands, a transmutation were to take place, and we were to find inside it, oh, I don't know, shall we say Pascal's Pensée? He articulated the title with an ironic emphasis, so as not to appear pedantic, and then in the gilt and tilled volumes which we open once in 10 years, he went on showing that contempt for worldly matters, which some men of the world like to affect, we should read that the queen of the Hellenes had arrived at Cannes, or that the Princesse de Lyon had given a fancy dress ball. In that way we should arrive at a happy medium. But at once regretting that he had allowed himself to speak of serious matters, even in jest, he said ironically, "What a fine conversation we're having! I can't think why we climb to these lofty heights." And then, turning to my grandfather, well, Saint-Simon tells how Maulevrier had the audacity to try to shake hands with his sons. You remember how he says of Maulevrier, "Never did I find in that coarse bottle anything but ill humor, boorishness, and folly." Coarse or not, I know bottles in which there's something very different, said Flora briskly, feeling bound to thank Swann as well as her sister, since the present of Asti had been addressed to them both. Céline laughed. Swann was puzzled, but went on. "I cannot say whether it was ignorance or cozenage," writes Saint-Simon. "He tried to give his hand to my children. I noticed it in time to prevent him." My grandfather was already in ecstasies over ignorance or cozenage, but Mademoiselle Céline, the name of Saint-Simon, a man of letters, having arrested the complete paralysis of her auditory faculties, was indignant. "What, you admire that? But that's a fine thing, I must say. But what's it supposed to mean? Is one man as good as the next? Isn't one man as good as the next? What difference can it make whether he's a duke or a groom, as long as he's intelligent and kind? He had a fine way of bringing up his children, your Saint-Simon. If he didn't teach them to shake hands with all decent folk. Really and truly, it's abominable, and you dare to quote it?" And my grandfather, utterly depressed, realizing how futile it would be against this opposition to attempt to get Swann to tell him the stories which would have amused him, murmured to my mother, "Just tell me again that line of yours which always comforts me so much on these occasions. Oh yes, what virtues, Lord, thou makest us abhor. How good that is." I never took my eyes off my mother. I knew that when they were at table I should not be permitted to stay there for the whole of dinner time, and that Mamma, for fear of annoying my father, would not allow me to kiss her several times in public, as I would have done in my room. And so I promised myself that in the dining room, as they began to eat and drink, and as I felt the hour approach, I would put beforehand into this kiss, which was bound to be so brief and furtive, everything that my own efforts could muster, would carefully choose in advance that exact spot on her cheek where I imprinted, and would so prepare my thoughts as to be able, thanks to these mental preliminaries, to consecrate the whole of the minute Mamma, to consecrate the whole of the minute Mamma would grant me to the sensation of her cheek against my lips. As a painter who can have his subject for short sittings only prepares his palette, and from what he remembers and from rough notes does in advance everything which he possibly can do in the sitter's absence. But tonight, before the dinner bell had sounded, My grandfather said with unconscious cruelty, "The little man looks tired. He'd better go up to bed. But besides, we're dining late tonight." And my father, who was less scrupulous than my grandmother or my mother in observing the letter of a treaty, went on, "Yes, run along off to bed." I would have kissed Mamma then and there, but at that moment the dinner bell rang. "No, no, leave your mother alone. You've said good night to one another, that's enough. These exhibitions are absurd. Go on upstairs." And so I must set forth with viaticum, must climb each step of the staircase against my heart, and as the saying is, climbing in opposition to my heart's desire, which was to return to my mother, since she had not, by kissing me, given my heart leave to accompany me. That hateful staircase, up which I always went so sadly, gave out a smell of varnish which had, as it were, absorbed and crystallized the special quality of sorrow that I felt each evening, and made it perhaps even crueler to my sensibility, because when it assumed this olfactory guise, my intellect was powerless to resist it. When we have gone to sleep without with a raging toothache, and are conscious of it only as of a little girl whom we attempt time after time to pull out all of the water, or a line of Molière, which we repeat incessantly to ourselves, it is a great relief to wake up so that our intelligence can disentangle the idea of toothache from any artificial semblance of heroism or rhythmic cadence. It was the converse of this relief which I felt when my anguish at having to go up to my room invaded my consciousness in a manner infinitely more rapid, instantaneous almost, a manner at once insidious and brutal through the inhalation, far more poisonous than moral penetration, of the smell of varnish peculiar to that staircase. Once in my room, I had to stop every loophole, to close the shutters, to dig my own grave as I turned down the bedclothes, to wrap myself in the shroud of my nightshirt, but before burying myself in the iron bed, which had been placed there because on summer nights I was too hot among the rep curtains of the four-poster, I was stirred to revolt, and attempted the desperate stratagem of a condemned prisoner. I wrote to my mother begging her to come upstairs for an important reason which I could not put in writing. My fear was that Francois, my aunt's cook, who used to be put in charge of me when I was at Combray, might refuse to take my note. I had a suspicion that in her eyes, to carry a message to my mother when there was a guest would appear as flatly inconceivable as for the doorkeeper of a theatre to hand a letter to an actor upon the stage. On the subject of things which might or might not be done, she possessed a code at once imperious, abundant, subtle, and uncompromising on points themselves imperceptible or irrelevant, which gave it a resemblance to those ancient laws which combine such cruel ordinances as the massacre of infants at the breast with prohibitions of exaggerated refinement against seething the kid in his mother's milk, or eating the sinew which is upon the hollow of the thigh. This code, judging by the sudden obstinacy which she would put into her refusal to carry out certain of our instructions, seemed to have provided for social complexities and refinements of etiquette which nothing in Francois' background or in her career as a servant in a village household could have put into her head, and we were obliged to assume that there was latent in her some past existence in the ancient history of France, noble and little understood, as in those manufacturing towns where Old mansions still testified to their former courtly days, and chemical workers toil among delicately sculptured scenes from Le Miracle de Vieilleville or Le Quatre Filles Aimants. In this particular instance, the article of her code, which made it highly improbable that, barring an outbreak of fire, Francois would go down and disturb Mamma in the presence of Monsieur Swann, for so unimportant a person as myself was one embodying the respect she showed not only for the family as for the dead, for the clergy, or for royalty, but also for the stranger within our gates, a respect which I should perhaps have found touching in a book, but which never failed to irritate me on her lips, because of the solemn and sentimental tones in which she would express it, and which irritated me more than usual this evening when the sacred character with which she invested the dinner party might have the effect of making her decline to disturb its ceremonial. But to give myself a chance of success, I had no hesitation in lying, telling her that it was not in the least myself who had wanted to write to Mamma, but Mamma who, on saying good night to me, had begged me not to forget to send her an answer about something she had asked me to look for, and that she would certainly be very angry if this note were not taken to her. I think that Francois disbelieved me, for like those primitive men whose senses were so much keener than our own, she could immediately detect, from signs imperceptible to the rest of us, the truth or falsehood of anything that we might wish to conceal from her. She studied the envelope for 5 minutes, as though an examination of the paper itself and the look of my handwriting could enlighten her as to the nature of the contents, or to tell her to which article of her code she ought to refer the matter. Then she went out with an air of resignation which seemed to imply, "It's hard lines on parents having a child like that." A moment later she returned to say that they were still at the ice stage and that it was impossible for the butler to deliver the note at once, in front of everybody, but that when the finger bowls were put round, he would find a way of slipping it into Mamma's hand. At once my anxiety subsided. It was now no longer, as it had been a moment ago, until tomorrow that I had lost my mother, since my little note, though it would annoy her, no doubt, and doubtless so because this stratagem would make me ridiculous in Swann's eyes, would at least admit me, invisible and enraptured, into the same room as herself, would whisper about me into her ear, since that forbidden and unfriendly dining room, where but a moment ago the ice itself, with burned nuts in it, and the finger bowls, seemed to me to be concealing pleasures that were baleful and of a mortal sadness because Mamma was tasting of them while I was far away, had opened its doors to me and, like a ripe fruit which burst through the skin, was going to pour out into my intoxicated heart the sweetness of Mamma's attention, while she was reading what I had written. Now I was no longer separated from her. The barriers were down, an exquisite thread united us. Besides, that was not all, for surely Mamma would come. As for the agony through which I had just passed, I imagined that Swann would have laughed heartily at it if he had read my letter and had guessed its purpose, whereas on the contrary, as I was to learn in due course, a similar anguish had been the bane of his life for many years, and no one perhaps could have understood my feelings at that moment so well as he. To him, the anguish that comes from knowing that the creature one adores is in some place of enjoyment where oneself is not and cannot follow. To him that anguish came through love, to which it is in a sense predestined, by which it will be seized upon and exploited. But when, as had befallen me, it possesses one's soul, before love has yet entered into one's life. Then it must drift awaiting love's coming vague and free, without precise attachment, at the disposal of one's sentiment of one's sentiment today, of another tomorrow, of filial piety or affection for a friend. And the joy with which I first bound myself apprentice, when Francois returned to tell me that my letter would be delivered, Swann, too, had known well. That false joy which a friend or relative of the woman we love can give us when on his arrival at the house of theater where she is to be found for some ball or party or first night at which he is to meet her. He sees us wandering outside, desperately awaiting some opportunity of communicating with her. He recognizes us, greets us familiarly, and asks what we are doing there. And when we invent a story of having some urgent message to give to his relative or friend, he assures us that nothing could be simpler, takes us in at the door, and promises to send her down to us in 5 minutes. How we loved him at that moment at that moment I loved Francois, the good-natured intermediary, who by a single word has made supportable human, almost propitious the inconceivable infernal scene of gaiety in the thick of which we had been imagining swarms of enemies, perverse and seductive, beguiling away from us, even making laugh at us, the woman we love. If we are to judge of them by him, this relative who has accosted us, and who is himself an initiate in those cruel mysteries, then the other guests cannot be so very demoniacal. Those inaccessible and excruciating hours during which he was about to taste of unknown pleasures, suddenly, through an unexpected breach, we have broken into them. Suddenly we can picture to ourselves, we possess, we intervene upon, we have almost created one of the moments, the succession of which would have composed these hours, a moment as real as all the rest, if not actually more important to us, because our mistress is more intensely a part of it, namely, the moment in which he goes to tell her that we are waiting below. And doubtless the other moments of the party would not have been so very different from this one, would be no more exquisite, no more calculated to make us suffer, since this kind friend has assured us that of course she will be delighted to come down. It would be far more amusing for her to talk to you than to be bored up there. Alas, Swann had learned by experience that the good intentions of a third party are powerless to influence a woman who is annoyed to find herself pursued even into a ballroom by a man she does not love. Too often the kind friend comes down again alone. My mother did not appear, but without the slightest consideration for my self-respect, which depended upon her keeping up the fiction that she had asked me to let her know the result of my search for something or other, told Francois to tell me in so many words. There is no answer. Words I have so often since then heard the hop Words I have so often since then heard the hall porters and grand hotels and the flunkies and gambling clubs, and the like repeat to some poor girl who replies in bewilderment. What? He said, nothing? It's not possible. You did give him my letter, didn't you? Very well, I shall wait a little longer. And just as she invariably protests that she does not need the extra gas jet which the porter offers to light for her, and sits on there, hearing nothing further except an occasional remark on the weather, which the porter exchanges with a bellhop whom he will send off suddenly when he notices the time to put some customer's wine on the ice. So, having declined Francois's offer to make me some tea or to stay beside me, I let her go off again to the pantry and lay down and shut my eyes, trying not to hear the voices of my family who were drinking their coffee in the garden. But after a few seconds I realized that by writing that note to Mama, by approaching, at the risk of making her angry, so near to her that I felt I could reach out and grasp the moment in which I should see her again. I had cut myself off from the possibility of going to sleep until I actually had seen her, and my heart began to beat more and more painfully as I increased my agitation by ordering myself to keep calm and to acquiesce in my ill fortune. Then suddenly my anxiety subsided. A feeling of intense happiness coursed through me, as when a strong medicine begins to take effect and one's pain vanishes. I had formed a resolution to abandon all attempts to go to sleep without seeing Mama. Had made up my mind to kiss her at all costs, even though this meant the certainty of being in disgrace with her for long afterwards. When she herself came up to bed, the calm which succeeded my anguish filled me with extraordinary exhilaration, no less than any sense of expectation, my thirst for and my fear of danger. Noiselessly I opened the window and sat down on the foot of my bed. I hardly dared to move in case they should hear me from below. Outside things too seemed frozen, wrapped in a mute intentness not to disturb the moonlight, which duplicating each of them and throwing it back by the extension in front of it of a shadow denser and more concrete than its substance had made the whole landscape at once thinner and larger, like a map which after being folded up is spread out upon the ground, but had to move. A leaf of the chestnut tree, for instance, moved, but its minute, quivering, total, self-contained, finished down to its minutest gradation, and its last, the delicate tremor, did not impinge upon the rest of the scene, did not merge with it, remained circumscribed, exposed upon the surface of silence which absorbed nothing of them. The most distant sounds, those which must have come from gardens at the far end of the town, could be distinguished with such exact finish that the impression they gave of coming from a distance seemed due only to their pianissimo execution, like those moments on muted strings so well performed by the orchestra of the conservatoire that even though one does not miss a single note, one thinks none the less that they are being played somewhat outside, a long way from the concert hall, so that all the old subscribers, my grandmother's sisters too, when Swan had given them his seats, used to train their ears as if they had caught the distant approach of an army on the march, which had not yet rounded the corner of the Rue de Trevis. I was well aware that I had placed myself in a position than which none could be counted upon to involve me in graver consequences at my parents' hands, consequences far graver indeed than a stranger would have imagined, and such as he would have thought could follow only some really shameful misdemeanor. But in the upbringing which they had given me, faults were not classified in the same order as in that of other children, and I had been taught to place at the head of the list, doubtless because there was no other class of faults from which I needed to be more carefully protected, those in which I can now distinguish the common feature that one succumbs to them by yielding to a nervous impulse. But such a phrase had never been uttered in my hearing. No one had yet accounted for my temptations in a way which might have led me to believed that there was some excuse for my giving in to them, or that I was actually incapable of holding out against them. Yet I could easily recognize this class of transgressions by the anguish of mind which preceded, as well as by the rigor of the punishment which followed them. And I knew that what I had just done was in the same category as certain other sins for which I had been severely punished, though infinitely more serious than they. When I went out to meet my mother on her way up to bed, and when she saw that I had stayed up in order to say good night to her again in the passage, I should not be allowed to stay in the house a day longer. I should be packed off to school next morning, so much was certain. Very well, had I been obliged the next moment to, to hurl myself out of the window, I should still have preferred such a fate. For what I wanted now was Mamma, to say good night to her. I had gone too far along the road which led to the fulfillment of this desire to be able to retrace my steps. I could hear my parents' footsteps as they accompanied Swan to the gate, and when the clanging of the bell assured me that he had really gone, I crept to the window. Mamma was asking my father if he had thought the lobster good, and whether Monsieur Swan had had a second helping of the coffee and pistachio ice. I thought it rather so-so, she was saying. Next time we shall have to try another flavor. I can't tell you, said my great aunt, what a change I find in Swan. He is quite antiquated. She had grown so accustomed to seeing Swan always in the same stage of adolescence that it was a shock to her to find him suddenly less young than the age she still attributed to him. And the others too were beginning to remark in Swan that abnormal, excessive, shameful, and deserved senescence of bachelors, of all those for whom it seems that the great day which knows no morrow must be longer than for other men, since for them it is void of promise, and from its dawn the moments steadily accumulate with any subsequent partition among offspring. I fancy he has a lot of trouble with that wretched wife of his, who lives with a certain Monsieur de Chaloux, as all Combray knows, is the talk of the town. My mother observed that in spite of this, he had looked much less unhappy of late, and he doesn't nearly so often do that trick of his, so like his father, of wiping his eyes and drawing his hand across his forehead. I think myself that in his heart he beats his heart of hearts he no longer loves that woman. Why, of course he doesn't, answered my grandfather. He wrote me a letter about it ages ago, to which I took care to pay no attention, but it left no doubt as to his feelings, or at any rate his love for his wife. Hello, you two. You never thanked him for the Asti, he went on, turning to his sisters-in-law. What? We never thanked him? I think between you and me that I put it to him quite neatly, replied my Aunt Flora. Yes, you managed it very well, and I admired you for it, said my Aunt Celine. But you did it very prettily, too. Yes, I was rather proud of my remark about nice neighbors. What? Do you call that thanking him? Shouted my grandfather. I heard that all right, but devil take me if I guessed it was meant for Swan. You may be quite sure he never noticed it. Come, come, Swan isn't a fool. I'm sure he understood. You didn't expect me to tell him the number of bottles, or to guess what he paid for them. My father and mother were left alone and sat down for a moment. Then my father said, Well, shall we go up to bed? As you wish, dear, though I don't feel at all sleepy. I don't know why. It can't be the coffee ice. It wasn't strong enough to keep me awake like this. but I see a light in the servants' hall. Poor Francois has been sitting up for me, so I'll get her to unhook me while you go and undress." My mother opened the lattice door which led from the hall to the staircase. Presently I heard her coming upstairs to close her window. I went quietly into the passage. My heart was beating so violently that I could hardly move. But at last it was throbbing no longer with anxiety, but with terror and joy. I saw in the well of the stair light coming upwards from Mamma's candle. Then I saw Mamma herself, and I threw myself upon her for an instant. She looked at me in astonishment, not realizing what could have happened. Then her face assumed an expression of anger. She said not a word to me, and indeed I used to go for days on end without being spoken to for far more venial offenses than this. A single word from Mamma would have been an admission that further intercourse with me was within bounds of possibility, and that might perhaps have appeared to me more terrible still, as indicating that with such a punishment as was in store for me, mere silence and black looks would have been puerile. A word from her then would have implied the false calm with which one addresses a servant to whom one has just decided to give notice. The kiss one bestows on a son who is being packed off to enlist, which would have been denied him if it had merely been a matter of being angry with him for a few days. But she heard my father coming from the dressing room, where he had gone to take off his clothes, and to avoid the scene which he would make if he saw me, she said to me in a voice half stifled with anger, "Off you go at once. Do you want your father to see you waiting there like an idiot?" But I implored again, "Come and say good night to me," terrified as I saw the light from my father's candle already creeping up the wall, but also making use of his approach as means of blackmail, in the hope that my mother, not wishing him to find me there, as find me he must, if she continued to refuse me, would give in and say, "Go back to your room, I will come." Too late, my father was upon us. Instinctively I murmured, though no one heard me, "I'm done for." I was not, however. My father used constantly to refuse to let me do things which were quite clearly allowed by the more liberal charters branded me by my mother and grandmother, because he paid no heed to principles, and because for him there was no such thing as the rule of law. For some quite irrelevant reason, or for no reason at all, he would at the last moment prevent me from taking some particular walk, one so regular, so hallowed, that to deprive me of it was a clear breach of faith. Or again, as he had done this evening, long before the appointed hour, he would snap out, "Run along up to bed now, no excuses." But at the same time, because he was devoid of principles, in my grandmother's sense, he could not, strictly speaking, be caught intransigent. He looked at me for a moment with an air of surprise and annoyance, and then, when Mamma had told him, not without some embarrassment, what had happened, said to her, "Go along with him, then. You said just now that you didn't feel very sleepy, so stay in his room for a little. I don't need anything." "But my dear," my mother answered timidly, "whether or not I feel sleepy is not the point. We mustn't let the child get into the habit." "There's no question of getting into a habit," said my father, with a shrug of the shoulders. "You can see quite well that the child is unhappy. After all, we aren't jailers. You end by making him ill, and a lot of good that will do. There are 2 beds in his room. Tell Francois to make up the big one for you and stay with him for the rest of the night. Anyhow, I'm off to bed. I'm not so nervy as you. Good night." It was impossible for me to thank my father, he would have been exasperated by what he called mawkishness. I stood there, not daring to move. He was still in front of us, a tall figure in his white nightshirt, crowned with a pink and violet cashmere scarf, which he used to wrap around his head since he had begun to suffer from neuralgia, standing like Abraham in the engraving after Benozzo Gozzoli, which Monsieur Swann had given me, telling Sarah that she must tear herself away from Isaac. Many years have passed since that night. The wall of the staircase up which I had watched the light of his candle gradually climb was long ago demolished. Near myself too, many things have perished which I imagined would last forever, and new ones have arisen, given birth to new sorrows and new joys, which in those days I could not have foreseen. Just as now the old are hard to understand. It is a long time too since my father has been able to say to Mama, "Go along with the child." Never again will such moments be possible for me, but of late I have been increasingly able to catch, if I listen attentively, the sound of the sobs which I had the strength to control in my father's presence, and which broke out only when I found myself alone with Mama. In reality, the echo has never ceased, and it is only because life is now growing more and more quiet round about me that I hear them anew, like those convent bells which are so effectively drowned during the day by the noises of the street that one would suppose them to have stopped, until they rang out again through the silent evening air. Mama spent that night in my room when I had just committed an offense for which I expected to be banished from the household. My parents gave me a far greater concession than I could ever have won as the reward of a good deed, even at the moment when it manifested itself in this crowning mercy. My father's behavior towards me still retained that arbitrary and unwarranted quality which was so characteristic of him, and which arose the fact that his actions were generally dictated by chance expediencies rather than based on any formal plan. And perhaps even what I called his severity, when he sent me off to bed, deserved that title less than my mother's or my grandmother's attitude towards nature, which in some respects differed more than theirs from my own, had probably prevented him from realizing until then how wretched I was every evening, something which my mother and grandmother knew well. But they loved me enough to be unwilling to spare me that suffering, which they hoped to teach me to overcome, so as to reduce my nervousness, my nervous sensibility, and to strengthen my will, whereas my father, whose affection for me was of another kind, would not, I suspect, have had the same courage, for as soon as he had grasped the fact that I was unhappy, he had said to my mother, "Go and comfort him." Mamma stayed that night in my room, and it seemed that she did not wish to mar my recrimination, those hours which were so different from anything that I had a right to expect. For when Francois, who guessed that something extraordinary must have happened, when she saw Mamma sitting by my side, holding my hand and letting me cry unchided, said to her, "But, madam, what is young master crying for?" She replied, "Why, Francois, he doesn't know himself. It's his nerves. Make up the big bed for me quickly and then go off to your own." And thus for the first time my unhappiness was regarded no longer as a punishable offense, but as an involuntary ailment, which had been officially recognized a nervous condition, for which I was in no way responsible. I had the consolation of no longer having to mingle apprehensive scruples with the bitterness of my tears. I could weep henceforth without sin. I felt no small degree of pride either in Francois's presence at this return to humane conditions, which not an hour after Mama had refused to come up to my room and had sent the snubbing message that I was to go to sleep, raised me to the dignity of a grown-up person, brought me of a sudden a sort of puberty of sorrow, a manumission of tears. I ought to have been happy, I was not. It struck me that my mother had just made a first concession, which must have been painful to her, that it was a first abdication on her part from the ideal she had formed for me, and that for the first time she who was so brave had to confess herself beaten. It struck me that if I had just won a victory, it was over her, and that I succeeded as sickness or sorrow or age might have succeeded in relaxing her will and undermining her judgment, and that this evening opened a new era, would remain a black date in the calendar. And if I had dared now, I should have said to Mama, "No, I don't want you to. You mustn't sleep here." But I was conscious of the practical wisdom of what would nowadays be called the realism with which she tempered the ardent idealism of my grandmother's nature, and I knew that now the mischief was done, she would prefer to let me enjoy the soothing pleasure of her company, and not to disturb my father again. Certainly my mother's beautiful face seemed to shine again with youth that evening, as she said as she sat gently holding my hands and trying to check my tears. But this was just what I felt should not have been. Her anger would have saddened me less than this new gentleness. Unknown to my childhood experience, I felt that I had with an impious and secret finger traced a first wrinkle upon her soul, and brought out a first white hair on her head. This thought redoubled my sobs, and then I saw that Mamma, who had never allowed herself to indulge in any undue emotion with me, was suddenly overcome by my tears, and had to struggle to keep back her own. When she realized that I had noticed this, she said to me with a smile, "Why, my little chick, my little canary, he's going to make Mamma as silly as himself if this goes on. Look, since you can't sleep, and Mamma can't either, we mustn't go on in this stupid way. We must do something. I'll get one of your books." But I had none there. "Would you like me to get out the books now that your grandmother is going to give you for your birthday? Just think it over first, and don't be disappointed if there's nothing new for you then." I was only too delighted, and Mamma went to fetch a parcel of books of which I could not distinguish through the paper in which they were wrapped, any more than their short, wide format, but which even at the first glimpse, brief and obscure as it was, bade fair to eclipse already the paint-box of New Year's Day and the silkworms of the year before. The books were Le Maire au Diable, François Le Champi, Le Petit Faudet, and Les Maîtres Sonneurs. My grandmother, as I learned afterwards, had at first chosen Musset's poems, a volume of Rousseau and Indiana, for while she considered light reading as unwholesome as sweets and cakes, she did not reflect that the strong breath of genius might have upon the mind even of a child an influence at once more dangerous and less invigorating than that of fresh air and sea breezes upon his body. But when my father had almost called her an imbecile, on learning the names of the books she proposed to give me, she had journeyed back by herself to Jouy le Vicomte, to the bookseller's, so that there should be no danger of my not having my present in time. It was a boiling hot day, and she had come home so unwell that the doctor had warned my mother not to allow her to tire herself so, and had fallen back upon the four pastoral novels of George Sand. "My dear," has said to Mamma, I could not bring myself to give the child anything that was not well written. The truth was that she could never permit herself to buy anything from which no intellectual profit was to be derived, above all the profit with which fine things afford us, by teaching us to seek our pleasures elsewhere than in the barren satisfaction of worldly wealth. Even when she had to make someone a present of the kind called useful, when she had to give an armchair or some table, silver, or a walking stick, she would choose antiques, as though their long desuetude had effaced from them any semblance of utility, and fitted them rather to instruct us in the lives of the men of other days than to serve the common requirements of her own. She would have liked me to have in my room photographs of ancient buildings or of beautiful places, but at the moment of buying them, and for all that the subject of the picture had an aesthetic value, she would find that vulgarity and utility had too prominent a part in them, that the mechanical nature of their reproduction by photography. She attempted by a subterfuge, if not to eliminate altogether this commercial banality, at least to minimize it, to supplant it to a certain extent with what was art still, to introduce, as it were, several thickness of art instead of photographs of Chartres Cathedral, of the fountains of St. Cloud, or of Vesuvius. She would inquire of Swann whether some great painter had not depicted them, and preferred to give them the photographs of Chartres Cathedral after Corot, of the fountains of St. Cloud after Hubert Robert, and of Vesuvius after Turner, which were a stage higher in the scale of art. But although the photographer had been prevented from producing directly these masterpieces or beauties of nature, and had there been replaced by a great artist, he resumed his odious position when it came to reproducing the artist's interpretation. Accordingly, having to reckon again with vulgarity, my grandmother would endeavor to postpone the moment of contact still further. She would ask Swann if the picture had not been engraved, preferring when possible old engravings, with some intrusive association apart from themselves, such for example as show us a masterpiece in a state in which we can no longer see it today, like Morgan's print of Leonardo's Last Supper before its defacement. It must be admitted that the results of this method of interpreting the art of making presents were not always happy. The idea which I formed of Venice from a drawing by Titian, which is supposed to have the lagoon in the background, was certainly far less accurate than what I should have derived from ordinary photographs. We could no longer keep count in the family, and my great aunt wanted to draw up an indictment of my grandmother, of all the armchairs she had presented to married couples, young and old, which on a first attempt to sit down upon them had at once collapsed beneath the weight of their recipients. But my grandmother would have thought it sordid to concern herself too closely with the solidity of any piece of furniture, which could still be discarded, which could still be discerned a flourish, a smile, a brave conceit of the past, and even what in such pieces answered a material need, since it did so in a manner to which we are no longer accustomed, charmed her like those old forms of speech in which we can still see traces of a metaphor whose fine point has been worn away by the rough usage of our modern tongue. As it happened, the pastoral novels of George Sand, which she was giving me for my birthday, were regular lumber rooms full of expressions that have fallen out of use and become quaint and picturesque, and are now only to be found in country dialects. And my grandmother had bought them in preference to other books, as she would more readily have taken a house with a Gothic Dovecote or some other such piece of antiquity as will exert a benign influence on the mind by giving it a hankering for impossible journeys through the realms of time. Mamma sat down by my bed. She had chosen Francois Le Champi, whose reddish cover and incomprehensible title gave it for me a distinct personality and a mysterious attraction. I had not then read any real novels. I had heard it said that George Sand was a typical novelist. This predisposed me to imagine that Francois Le Champi contained something inexpressibly delicious. The narrative device is designed to arouse curiosity or melt to pity, certain modes of expression which disturb or sadden the reader, and which, with a little experience, he may recognize as common to a great many novels, seem to me for whom a new book was not one of a number of similar objects, but as it were a unique person, absolutely self-contained, simply an intoxicating distillation of the peculiar essence of Francois Le Champi. Beneath the everyday incidences, the ordinary objects had, and common words, a sense of strange and individual tone of voice. The plot began to unfold to me. It seemed all the more obscure because in those days when I read, I used often to daydream about something quite different for page after page, and the gaps which this habit left in my knowledge of the story were widened by the fact that when it was Mamma who was reading to me aloud, she left all the love scenes out, and so all the odd changes which take place in the relations between the miller's wife and the boy, changes which only the gradual dawning of love can explain, seemed to me steeped in a mystery, the key to which I readily believed lay in that strange and mellifluous name of Champi, which invested the boys who bore it. I had no idea why, with its own vivid, ruddy, charming color. If my mother was not a faithful reader, she was none the less an admirable one. When reading a work in which she found the note of true feeling, and the respectful simplicity of her interpretation, and the beauty and sweetness of her voice, even in ordinary life when it was not works of art, but men and women whom she was moved to pity or admire, that touching to observe with what deference she would banish from her voice, her gestures, from her whole conversation, now the note of gaiety which might have distressed some mother who had once lost a child, now the recollection of an event or anniversary which might have reminded some old gentleman of the burden of his years, now the household topic which might have bored some young man of letters. And so, when she read aloud the prose of George Sand, prose which is everywhere redolent of that generosity and moral distinction which Mamma had learned from my grandmother to place above all other qualities in life, and which I was not to teach her until much later, to refrain from placing above all other qualities in literature, to, to, qualities in literature too, taking pains to banish from her voice any pettiness or affectation which might have choked that powerful stream of language. She supplied all the natural tenderness, all the lavish sweetness which they demanded to sentences which seemed to have been composed for her voice, and which were all, so to speak, within the compass of her sensibility. She found to tackle them in the required tone, the warmth of feeling which pre-existed and dictated them, but which is not to be found in the words themselves, and by this means she smoothed away, as she read, any harshness or discordance in the tenses of verbs, endowing the imperfect and the preterite with all the sweetness to be found in generosity, all the melancholy to be found in love, guiding the sentence that was drawing to a close towards the one that was about to begin, now hastening, now slackening the pace of the syllables so as to bring them, despite their differences of quantity, into a uniform rhythm, and breathing into this quite ordinary prose a kind of emotional life and continuity. My aching heart was soothed. I let myself be borne upon the current of this gentle night on which I had my mother by my side. I knew that such a night could not be repeated, that the strongest desire I had in the world, namely, to keep my mother in my room through the sad hours of darkness, ran too much counter to general requirements and to the wishes of others for such a concession as had been granted me this evening to be anything but a rare and artificial exception. Tomorrow night, my anguish would return and Mama would not stay by my side, but when my anguish was assuaged, I could no longer understand it. Besides, tomorrow was still a long way off. I told myself that I should still have time to take preventive action, although that time could bring me no access to power, since these things were in no way dependent upon the exercise of my will, and seemed not quite inevitable, only because they were still separated from me by this short interval. Okay, if you listen to this entire thing, thank you. Um, it, 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 it wasn't easy. It wasn't easy because of my stutter. I read pages 1 through 58, and next time I will start on page 58 until another part. Thanks. Okay, that was my attempt at reading pages 1 through 58 of In Search of Lost Time by Marcel Proust. I hope you understood what I was saying despite my speech, but yeah. I will continue to make more videos of me reading this novel over the next year, I guess. And also I'll be updating my camera, so I'll be using an actual camera instead of a webcam. And thanks for listening, and subscribe if you want. If you don't want to subscribe, you don't have to. Yeah.